My main trick of the evening will be to make this great unclean one disappear in about 10 seconds with the help of my trusty assistant, fire. Before that though, let's make sure we understand the basics of fire and what it can and can't do. So fire damage can be on your melee attacks or missile attacks, indicated by the little symbol on the unit card. It can also come in the form of spells and abilities. The thing about flaming attacks though is that they're kinda useless 80% of the time unless you find the right target. Those targets are of course anything with a weakness to fire. Now there's two key points to know about flaming attacks. Let's use an example here. I've got some Sargard great weapons and the Regiment of Renown version, which is basically the same but with flaming attacks. And they're both going to take on a Beast of Nurgle, which, what do you know, has a weakness to fire because it has regeneration. And its weakness to fire plus 20%, so any unit that has fire attacks or has fire damage from a spell, it'll do 20% more damage to this target. And as we can see here, the unit with the fire attacks has done a little more damage to its Beast of Nurgle than the non-fiery unit, although this one does have slightly better stats, but not by much. So you can do extra damage to units weak to fire with your flaming attack units. Simple enough, right? Now, the other more subtle effect of fire is to do with regeneration itself. You can see this Beast of Nurgle fighting the non-fire unit. It regenerates 6 health per second. That's pretty much its standard amount. But now if we look at the beast that's fighting the flaming attacks unit, we can notice it's only regenerating 3 health per second. 50% less when on fire, so to speak. Because that's what it says on the unit tooltip. When a unit is fighting a unit that has flaming attacks, it is on fire. And that on fire effect reduces regeneration, in this case, by 50%. So pretty powerful stuff. You get plus 20% damage and minus 50% regen, while the unit without flaming attacks can't make use of that weakness to fire. And you can see here how much quicker the flaming attack unit has killed its Beast of Nurgle. But do remember, that only comes into effect against a unit that is weak to fire. If it was a non-weak to fire unit, there would be no damage bonuses for those flaming attacks. Now, it's important to know that regeneration is usually the reason that a unit will be weak to fire, but not all regeneration means there is a weakness to fire. For example, the Festering Stooges here, they have regeneration, but no weakness to fire, so fire isn't going to do anything to them. The same with the vampire counts. Manfred here has the Hunger, which doesn't come with a weakness to fire. But the poor old Vargolf here has the same ability as the Beast of Nurgle, where it has regeneration that comes with a 20% weakness to fire. So just know that just because a unit regenerates health doesn't mean it necessarily has a weakness to fire. You have to check the abilities. But hey, what if a unit doesn't have a weakness to fire? Well, we're gonna give that motherfucker a weakness to fire, with a tactic we shall call
Fire Stack.
That brings me to my magic trick then. We're going to make this great unclean one disappear in about 10 seconds or so with these lovely fiery assistants from the Tzeentch army. Firstly, some flamers, who would you believe it have fire damage as well as the warp flame ability, which gives a 10% weakness to fire and a small reduction to armor as well. We also have a cultist who, as a firecaster, comes with the Kindle Flame ability, which casts a 20% weakness to fire whenever he casts a spell all across the enemy army. Thus, we can stack those two abilities to give a 30% weakness to fire to our desired target. And then we've got a couple of units of Pink Horrors who also have flaming attacks, and the Lord has a flaming ranged attack as well, and we are going to stack that fire damage on top of that weakness to fire. So here comes the fireball from the cultist. That's going to be Kindle Flame going off as well as a little damage from the fireball. We can see here on his unit card, he's got that weakness to fire 20%, so that's gone on him. Kindle Flame is active for around 10 seconds. And then we're going to bring in the flamer attacks, which are going to get an extra 20% damage done already, but they're also going to bring the extra 10% damage as well as the reduction to armor. So that's going to give the Great Unclean One a 30% weakness to fire, which means it's now open season for the rest of the army. In come the Pink Horror missiles, and we are going to delete half of his health in but a few seconds, which is a lot of health, by the way. This thing has 12,000 health. We're about to delete half of it, and then I'm going to cast another fire spell to get Kindle Flame going again, and then we're going to delete the other 6,000 health. So 6,000 health per volley, pretty good numbers, to say the least. And this is the power of the fire stack tactic, as we shall call it. We're not only stacking the weaknesses to fire on top of each other, we're also stacking the flaming attack damage from flaming attack units on top of each other. With the Pink Horrors, we could do Blue Horrors as well. We've got Flamers, we've got the Lord with his ranged attack, we've got the Cultist with a Fireball. We're stacking all that on a single target, and removing them while they have a weakness to fire. Because the Great Unclean One doesn't even have a weakness to fire normally. He doesn't regenerate, doesn't have any of that. We gave him a weakness to fire and removed the bastard. Do remember as well that some magic spells outside the Law of Fire also have fire attacks on them, and in this case for the Blue Fire of Tzeentch you have fire attacks and the Warp Flame ability, so you can give that weakness to fire and reduction to armor. There's a lot of different options and ways to get creative with this, so mess around with different factions, different spells, different units, and see what you can do to absolutely ruin enemies with fire. A couple of other examples on how we can get creative. We've got the Huntsman General here. He has an ability called Oil Flask, which will give a 40% weakness to fire. Then we can use a Fire Wizard for that Kindle Flame. There's another 20%. Plus this Strigoi Vampire Lord has Regeneration, so that's another 20%. And we can see here all these stacked penalties on top of each other, giving us a whopping 80% weakness to fire on this unit. And if we hit it with all that fire damage, it's gonna melt. Alas though, that 80% will only last 5 to 10 seconds if you can time it well, and then it will drop down to 60% or 40%, which are still good numbers of weakness to fire to add. And then we drop the Flaming Sword of Ruin on these handgunners, which gives them flaming attacks, aim them at this big boy, and he goes away pretty damn quick. So these kind of combos and fire stacking can be incredibly powerful if you can pull it off. It's not necessarily an easy tactic and it's kind of niche, but if you can set it up and make it happen, it can be devastating. Here's one more example, a little bit simpler maybe. We've got the Hell Pit, which is regenerating and weak to fire. We hit it with Kindle Flame and a Fireball, and also the Salamander brings a 20% weakness to fire. All in all, adding up to a 60% weakness to fire to this Hell Pit. Then we can stick Flaming Sword of Ruin on these spears as well and just absolutely ravage him. We can do a similar thing to this Rat Ogre who doesn't have a weakness to fire, but we can give him one of 40% and still do a fair bit of damage. So stack those weak to fire penalties, but do take note that you can only stack different weak to fire penalties. You can't stack two of the same like 2 lots of Kindle Flame, you'll just get the one. Now for one last thing to note on fire attacks, it's all about fire resistance, which is very important to take note of. Here we have, in this example, the Swords of Chaos, a fiery Chaos Cavalry that deal fiery damage but have no resistance for it. They're fighting the Fireborn who have flaming attacks and a 70% fire resistance. And if you look at the health here, the Swords of Chaos are getting absolutely battered while the Fireborn have barely lost anything. This is all because of that 70% fire resistance, which, because the Swords of Chaos have flaming attacks, their damage entirely is reduced by 70%. Which means they do sweet FA to the Fireborn. So you have to be pretty careful on who you get your flaming attack units attacking. Be careful it's not someone with a fire resistance, otherwise this might happen. It is a bit of a rarer case for the Fireborn, as 70% is a very high fire resistance that very few units have, but still you might see a 20% fire resistance or a 40% fire resistance, and that can have a pretty big effect on a matchup's outcome. So don't fight a Firebelly with Costaltin or Bloodletters. Don't shoot him with Pink Horrors because he has a 40% fire resistance and your damage is going to be very limited against him. You may not want to shoot the Hearthblades with Blue Horrors because they have a 20% fire resistance. Blue Horrors have fire attacks on their missiles and melee. So while not the end of the world, it's only 20%, it still is going to make them less effective than they could be. So unless there's no other option available, you may want to avoid wasting your ammo and melee skills on this fire-resistant unit. And lastly, for the love of Sigmar, don't use your Iron Drakes against the Firebark Elders, because you will do absolutely nothing. Literally. They have a 70% fire resistance, and as you can see, after 2 volleys from the Iron Drakes, they've lost no health basically. So a Fireborn situation again. But there we go, everything we need to know about fire damage and fire stacking. I hope you've enjoyed this, thanks for watching, I will see you in the future.